They say history remembers the victors. But in the story of Henry VIII, even victory stinks. When we hear his name, we imagine the king with 6 wives, the man who broke from Rome and built his own church. A ruler, a lover, a legend. But the truth? The truth is far uglier than any textbook dares to tell. This isn't just a story about power and love, it's the slow, relentless transformation of a man into a monster who began to rot alive inside his own palace. And the worst part? It all started like a fairy tale. Young Henry was everything a king was supposed to be. Tall, athletic, glowing with confidence. His cheeks were pink, his smile disarming. He could play music, write poetry, and crush his rivals in tournaments. Europe called him the Golden Prince. He believed his body was a temple of strength, his mind a gift from God. He didn't just think he ruled by divine right, he believed God spoke through him. And when you believe that, anything you do feels justified. Even cruelty. Even murder. As long as his body stayed strong, that illusion held. The world adored him, and he adored himself. But every myth has a crack. And Henry's appeared one cold winter day, in the sound of horses, metal, and screaming crowds. January, 1536. A jousting tournament. Henry charges into the arena, gleaming in silver armor, the picture of royal glory. The crowd roars. Then his horse stumbles. A single slip, and the world changes forever. The enemy's lance strikes him square in the head. The king falls, crashing to the ground with a sickening thud. 7 feet of metal and flesh, motionless. They say he lay unconscious for 2 hours. In the 16th century, that was as good as dead. When he finally opened his eyes, the Golden Prince was gone. Something darker had taken his place. After that fall, the world got a new Henry. And this Henry was no longer the Golden Prince. He was a man at war, not with enemies, but with his own body. It was as if something inside him had cracked open that day in the arena, and never healed again. At first, it was small things. He grew impatient. Angrier. His laughter turned sharp, his eyes darker. Then came the pain, deep, throbbing, constant. His legs began to swell. The skin blistered, then split. And from those cracks came the smell. A sickly, sweet rot that no perfume could mask. By the time he turned 40, Henry could barely walk. Each step was agony. Under his silk stockings, his calves were covered in ulcers, wide, open wounds that never healed. Servants said the bandages stuck to the flesh, and when they tried to change them, pieces of skin tore away with the cloth. They would gag, turn pale, or flee the room. Because working for the king had become a punishment. The courtiers joked quietly, "You can smell the king before you see him." But no one dared to laugh aloud. In Henry's England, a bad joke could cost you your head. His weight exploded. By his final years, his waist measured 54 inches, bigger than most men were tall. He weighed close to 400 pounds. They say the belt he wore as a young man could wrap 3 times around his old belly. He couldn't climb stairs. He couldn't mount a horse. He was carried everywhere, in a massive, wheeled chair fitted with gears and pulleys, built to lift him like a sack of grain. Every movement made him grunt in pain. But what truly terrified everyone was not the smell, or the size, or the wounds. It was his rage. His body was rotting, and he took revenge on the world for it. No one was safe, not his wives, not his friends, not even his children. Doctors were forbidden to speak of illness. To say the king was sick was treason. So they lied. They smeared his wounds with oils, with herbs, with boiled mixtures of animal fat. Some even used ground human bone, whispering that the body heals the body. Nothing worked. The smell grew stronger. The anger, sharper. And soon, people began to whisper. That the king was cursed. That the devil himself had taken residence in his flesh. That God was rotting him alive for his sins. At night, servants heard strange sounds from behind the locked doors, moans, growls, even laughter. Some swore they saw the king's face glisten in the candlelight, the eyes red, the sweat thick as blood. Many quit. Some went mad. Others stayed, because fear paid better than courage. To prepare him for sleep, servants drew lots. Whoever lost had to go near his bed. Some refused and fled the palace. One left a note that read only 2 words. "It stinks of hell." And they weren't wrong. Because Henry's body wasn't just decaying. It was becoming something else entirely, a symbol of power eating itself alive. When Henry's body finally betrayed him, his mind followed. The pain that lived in his flesh began to live in his thoughts. He no longer trusted anyone. Not his doctors. Not his advisors. Not even the guards who stood by his bed. He started to see enemies in every shadow. Every whisper in the corridor sounded like a plot. Every look, like a threat. Even love became dangerous. He began sleeping with loaded crossbows beside his bed. Knives under his pillow. Another under the mattress, just in case. The guards stood in his room all night, forbidden to move or close their eyes. But Henry didn't sleep either. He would sit upright in the dark, staring at the door, his breath heavy and uneven. Sometimes he shouted for the guards to check for poison, in his food, in his sheets, even in the air. The palace became a cage. He ordered secret passages to be built, hidden doors and narrow tunnels so he could escape if assassins came. But no one ever saw him use them. Because the only enemy still chasing Henry was inside his own mind. He had holes carved into the walls, tiny slits for spying. At night, he would listen through them, eavesdropping on his own courtiers. Sometimes he summoned people at dawn and accused them of treason, simply because of something he thought he'd heard through the stone. By now, fear had replaced loyalty. Servants spied on each other. Friends betrayed friends. Every word was dangerous. Every silence, suspicious. They said that the Tower of London never slept. Its cells were always full of people who had been close to the king only yesterday. One look, one rumor, one dream, and you could vanish forever. Henry even turned his suspicion on his children. Princess Mary. Princess Elizabeth. He believed they were plotting against him, though they were barely more than children. Each was assigned a personal servant, who secretly reported to the king. But the worst nights were the ones when he saw ghosts. They said he screamed in the darkness, shouting names that echoed through the halls. Thomas More. Anne Boleyn. Jane Seymour. All those he had loved, or hated, or killed, now returned to stare at him in silence. Servants said they could hear him begging the dead for mercy, then cursing them, then weeping like a child. But no one dared to enter the room. Because even if he called for help, it could be a trap. By now, Henry had become a prisoner in his own palace, surrounded by guards, shadows, and the echoes of the people he destroyed. He was no longer a ruler. He was the most powerful captive in England. And the palace that once symbolized the might of a king had become a fortress of fear. Winter, 1547. Whitehall Palace was silent. Too silent. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Behind heavy curtains, in a room thick with incense and fear, the most powerful man in England was dying. The air stank of medicine, sweat, and decay. Henry could no longer move. His body had swollen so much that even the royal blanket strained to cover him. Each breath was a fight, a deep, rattling gasp that sounded like death itself trying to claw its way in. His legs were 2 black wounds. The ulcers had eaten through the flesh. When doctors changed the bandages, the smell was so foul that even the most hardened of them turned away and gagged. They knew the truth. This was no longer life, just a body slowly becoming a coffin for the soul inside. But no one dared to say it. Not to him. Not to anyone. To speak of the king's death was treason. So the palace pretended. Guards stood at the doors. Cooks prepared food. Messengers delivered letters to a man who could no longer read them. Every morning, the doctors bowed and whispered that he was recovering. But everyone could smell the lie. He spent his nights in delirium. He screamed at the walls, calling out names that no one dared to answer. Anne Boleyn. Thomas More. Jane Seymour. Sometimes he cursed them. Sometimes he begged them to forgive him. And sometimes he just laughed, hoarse, broken, the laughter of a man who could no longer tell the difference between life and rot. The priests came every morning, chanting psalms in trembling voices. The words were supposed to drive death away. But death was already in the room. You could feel it standing beside the bed, patient, waiting. Henry's doctors met in secret. They argued over what to do. Who would tell him the truth? Who would be the first to say that the king, the man who called himself divine, was dying like any other mortal? No one volunteered. Because the first to speak would be the first to fall. Finally, someone sent for Archbishop Cranmer, the only man Henry still trusted. When Cranmer entered the room, the king was barely breathing. He couldn't speak. He could only move his fingers. The archbishop leaned close and whispered, "Your Majesty, do you place your faith in Christ and his mercy?" They say Henry squeezed his hand once. And then he let go. The candles flickered. The air went still. And after 37 years of ruling England, Henry VIII, the Golden Prince turned monster, was gone. But his death did not bring peace. It only began a new kind of chaos. For 3 days, the palace hid the truth. They locked the chambers, sealed the windows, and told the servants the king was resting. In the next rooms, his advisors whispered, plotting who would rule next. And all the while, the body lay there, heavy, swollen, and leaking through the sheets. They burned herbs and poured perfume over the floor, but it couldn't drown out the smell. It was the smell of power finally dying. When the death was finally announced, England didn't rejoice. It just exhaled. Because even in death, Henry remained dangerous. His body had begun to rot before the news reached the streets. Servants sealed the doors and burned herbs, but the sweet, sick smell seeped through the cracks. They wrapped the corpse in layers of linen soaked with oil and resin, then sealed it inside a lead-lined coffin. But the smell still came through. It clung to the corridors, to the curtains, to the hands of anyone who touched the body. One physician wrote that the odor stuck to the skin like guilt. At night, the palace was silent, but some swore they could still hear the king's footsteps in the halls. Slow. Heavy. As if he wasn't done walking yet. The funeral procession left Whitehall under candlelight. No cheers. No tears. Only the rattle of wheels on frozen ground. The coffin was so heavy that the floorboards cracked when they carried it down the stairs. The journey to Windsor took days. Every night, they stopped to rest, not for prayer, but to air out the stench. People along the road crossed themselves when the cart passed by. No one wanted to breathe the same air as the dead king. And then came the story that England would never forget. When the procession stopped overnight at Sion Abbey, a sound came from the coffin, a low, muffled thud. At first, they thought it was the wood settling. Then came another. And another. And suddenly, the air filled with a thick, choking stench. The lead had cracked. Gases from the decomposing body burst the seams, forcing a dark liquid to ooze from the coffin onto the stone floor. The servants panicked. Some fled the chapel. Others tried to seal the coffin again with hot wax and resin, but it was too late. By morning, the rumor had spread like wildfire. The king's coffin exploded. Whether it truly happened or not didn't matter. England believed it. And the legend grew darker with every telling. They said that dogs were seen licking the floor where the royal remains had spilled. Priests whispered that God had taken away Henry's greatness, leaving only the stench behind. When the procession finally reached Windsor, the coffin was carried carefully, as if it might burst again. The funeral was grand, black horses, bells, a wax effigy of Henry standing proudly atop the coffin. A perfect image of the king he once pretended to be, young, strong, untouchable. But beneath that image, the lead box leaked again. The air in the chapel was so foul that some priests fainted mid-prayer. The courtiers wept, but not from grief, from the smell. They buried him beside Jane Seymour, the only wife who gave him a son, and the only one who didn't live long enough to fall from his favor. The ground caved under the weight of the coffin. They had to widen the grave and reinforce the walls just to hold him. Even in death, he demanded more space than anyone else. Years later, people swore that the chapel still smelled faintly sweet, the scent of death that never left. Others claimed that on cold nights, when the wind swept through Windsor, they could hear a slow, heavy sound beneath the stone floor. Like someone knocking. From below. Maybe it was just the shifting earth. Or maybe it was Henry, still trying to get out. Henry VIII was dead. But England didn't wake to a new dawn. It woke to his shadow. For 3 days, the palace kept pretending he was still alive. Servants spoke in whispers. Guards stood by the doors as if waiting for orders. Cooks laid out meals that no one would eat. Some swore they still heard his footsteps at night, heavy, rhythmic, echoing down the halls. Only this time, no one bowed. A 9-year-old boy now sat on the throne, Edward, the child Henry had demanded the heavens deliver. He ruled in name only. Behind him, his uncle Edward Seymour pulled the strings. The first thing he did was cover Henry's portraits with dark curtains. He said, the king must be dead not only in body, but in memory. But England could not forget. The war Henry had started between God and man was far from over. Catholics called his death divine punishment. Thus rots the soul that betrayed Rome. Protestants said his mission was complete. That God had taken him home after freeing England from the Pope. Neither side was right. And both were wrong. Because the truth was simpler. Power had outlived the man. And its smell still lingered. In Windsor, priests refused to enter the crypt at night. They said they heard breathing from below, slow, labored, like someone trapped under the stone floor. Sometimes, a dull knock. Sometimes, the faint sound of footsteps. The church called it superstition. The servants called it Henry. Over the years, his children carried his shadow like a curse. Edward, pale and fevered, tried to finish what his father began, burning through faith and flesh until he died before manhood. Mary, the first queen in her own right, brought back the fires of Catholic vengeance, earning the name, Bloody Mary. And Elizabeth, clever, cautious, forever alone, ruled longer than them all. But even she ruled as if he were still watching her. Because to be Henry's child was to live with a ghost at your back. Historians still argue. Was he a visionary or a tyrant? A reformer or a madman? A man of God, or the devil's mirror? But one thing is certain. No king ever left a mark, or a smell, quite like Henry VIII. Even centuries later, when workers opened the crypt beneath St. George's Chapel, they said the air inside was warmer than it should have been. And that the scent, faint, but unmistakable, was the same one recorded in 1547. They say his ghost still walks the corridors of Windsor. A massive shape in red robes. Guards see him on security cameras, a blur, a shadow, and refuse to work the night shift. He doesn't speak. He doesn't harm. He just watches. Maybe these are only stories. Or maybe history simply doesn't let go of men like him. Because monsters don't disappear. They only change form. Sometimes, into memory. His body has long decayed, but his name still breathes. His palaces crumble, but his power whispers in hymns, in laws, in fear. And if you listen closely, within the cold stone walls of Windsor, you can still hear it. A slow, dull thud. Like someone, somewhere, is trying to get out.